Hi, everyone. Mike Malatesta here, and welcome back to the How Did Happen podcast. On this podcast, I dig in deep with every guest to explore the roots of their success, to discover not just how it happened, but why it matters. My mission is to find and share stories that inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you. On today's show, I'm having an amazing conversation with a guy who's 29 years young, thousands of years wise. We talk about his belief that through failure, all the magic happens, how trust is transitive. He's got an interesting model for that. The power of building credibility on the backs of others, and how swapping 15 minutes of social media time for 15 minutes of reading time can dramatically elevate the path of your success. Nick Hutchison is a force who helps authors create life-changing books.
15 minutes of reading for somebody who's just starting out is probably about 10 pages. And if you can do that twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, by replacing something like social media scrolling in the morning and maybe just the first 15 minutes of your Netflix in the evening, you can read 20 pages a day. Over, let's say, the 5 weekdays, that's 100 pages a week. And so by reading 100 pages a week, you can read a book every 2 weeks, every 2.5 weeks. That's 20 different areas of your life that you can improve, 20 different skills that you can develop, 20 different people that you can learn about, 20 different problems that you can solve. And again, it can happen in as little as 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening.
This episode is sponsored by The Dream Exit. The Dream Exit is a private, bespoke program for successful entrepreneurs with annual revenue between $5 and $100 million who realize that they have one chance to get their dream exit right, and that the odds of realizing that dream by themselves, all alone, or at the last minute are stacked against them. In less than 90 days, we teach you how to design, build, and execute a customized dream exit playbook that gets your business ready for sale at its maximum value and gets you ready to maximize your meaning and purpose in your post-exit life, even if you're not ready to sell today. You see, dream exits don't just happen. They're the result of early, professional, and proven planning. So if you're an entrepreneur with annual sales between $5 and $100 million, and you want to learn how to 10x to 100x your chances of achieving the dream exit you deserve, go to dreamexitplaybook.com today. And now, here's Nick Hutchison. Hey, Nick, welcome to the How Did Happen podcast.
I am excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. We had a little brief discussion that I won't ruin for everyone because I'm sure we'll talk to about it more. But you've got a very, very interesting background and approach to yourself and your business, and I'm very intrigued with it. So I'm glad we were able to set this up. I let all of you know a little bit about Nick and what we talked about in the intro, but let me tell you a little bit more about Nick Hutchison. So Nick stands as the visionary force behind Bookthinkers, a growing 7-figure marketing firm dedicated to helping people maximize their potential through books, particularly in the domains of personal development and business, which all of you have an interest in, I'm sure. The platform has fostered a community of lifelong learners who exchange book recommendations, reviews, and insights that seamlessly bridge the worlds of authors and readers. In just over 7 years, he has organically built a platform that reaches over 1 million people each month. And his podcast, Bookthinkers, Life-Changing Books, is top 2% show. And he's featured some really great guests. And I won't name the ones that have been on my show. I want to name the ones that have not been on my show, like Grant Cardone, Lewis Howes, Alex Hormozy, James Altucher, Stephen Pressfield, one of my favorite authors, Ryan Holiday, Peter Diamandis. You get the picture. This guy, he knows how to get great guests. So take a listen to his show. Through the use of his platform, Nick has helped hundreds of authors expand their reach to hundreds of millions of readers and drive significant revenue growth as part of their book campaigns. He's got a ton of services, including short form video production, podcast booking, social media, brand building, and a lot more. In other words, if you want your book to get noticed, Nick is a person that you want to know. Nick has a new book coming out. It's called Rise of the Reader. Subtitle is Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn. where he dives into the strategies for mastering your reading habits and applying what you learn. This book is available right now in pre-order on Amazon. Well, it comes out November 1st, so maybe it'll be out by the time the podcast is. But anyway, get the book on Amazon, Rise of the Readers. You can learn more about Nick at his website, bookthinkers.com. And I think all your socials are Bookthinkers as well, Nick. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So let's get started, Nick. How did it happen for you?
Well, this might be a surprise to everybody that just heard that introduction, but when I was growing up, I was not much of a reader. I was more of the it was not the academic. I was more of the athlete stereotype, not much of the academic. But going into my senior year of college, I went to the University of New Hampshire up in the Northeast. Going into my senior year, I took an internship at a local software company. And my boss at the time, Kyle, recognized that I had about a 1-hour commute each way, 5 days a week. So I was spending about 10 hours in the car. And all I listened to was music. And he said something to me. He said, Nick, listening to the same playlist for the 1,000th time, it's not going to get you closer to where you want to be in life. You should consider podcasts, business podcasts. And so I went on a few local trips with him. He introduced me to a few podcasts and I decided to listen to them. And so as I was commuting and listening, I was listening to how all of these people became successful. Really, that's what it was all about. And so many of those people gave at least some credit for their success to the books that they were reading. And I thought, well, if I'm deliberately choosing not to read these books, then I'm also deliberately choosing to live under my potential, because all of the people I want to be like, they're talking about books. And here I am. I thought it was cool not to read books. So I had it totally backwards. And so I went to my local Barnes & Noble. I picked up about 10 books, many of which were on my list. I had just heard them mentioned so many times on these podcasts. I went back to my internship and I didn't have a ton of responsibilities, but I had my own private office. So I started to read. I would read for 2, 3, 4 hours a day. And I just started to work through so many of the books that other people were recommending on these podcast interviews. And sort of the rest is history. So that's how it happened for me.
And how, tell me about the athletic part of your existence.
Yeah, when I was growing up, I was the oldest of 4 boys, and we're all very close in age. There's less than a 5-year window between all of us. So naturally, there was a lot of competition when we were younger. And I played a lot of sports. So growing up, I played everything. But in high school, I was captain of our wrestling team. And I also started on our football team. And we went to the Super Bowl. We got to play in Gillette Stadium on live TV. That was a ton of fun. And then as captain of the wrestling team, we won our division and I got to wrestle in states. And so that's where I focused all of my attention when I was younger. I think that it was where I felt more confident, kind of building through athleticism, not strictly through academics. And you know what's funny is I was capable from an academic standpoint. I just really chose not to apply myself. And I have all sorts of qualms or bones to pick with the US public education system and why I think that I could have loved it, but the structure made it so that I didn't. But yeah, football and wrestling, those were kind of my 2 main sports.
And that opens an interesting door. So the structure, what about the structure could or should be better to have made it more interesting to you?
What I disliked about my public education experience was that, number one, they taught me that failure was a bad thing. So you're penalized when you don't perform well, when you don't have the same view as your teachers. You're taught to avoid failure because you'll get criticized by other students and that will be reflected in your grades. And what's so funny now being on the other side of this is, as an entrepreneur, failure is the best thing ever. I mean, it really is. When you fail and you collect feedback and you remain optimistic and positive and opportunistic, you can learn and grow and iterate and change and things get better. And so through failure, all of the magic happens. But again, when I was growing up, I was so shy and insecure and scared, and I tried to avoid failure because I didn't see failure as a positive thing. So I think that's number one. The other thing that I'd like to mention is when I was younger, I had a lot of social anxiety, and it stems from this fear of failure and fear of judgment. but I couldn't perform well in front of a classroom. I was very shy. Like when we had to read in a circle, I'd count the number of paragraphs and I'd practice mine 10 times in a row, or excuse myself and go to the bathroom, or not show up when I had to do a presentation so I could do it after school. And the max presentation that I ever gave was maybe a few minutes. So I never became comfortable communicating in front of people. And recently I heard somebody say, imagine if I'll give a point of context. Recently I hosted my first event. I was on stage in front of a big room for 8 hours, moderating Q&As and doing all sorts of things. And by the end of the day, I felt totally at ease, because through that consistent exposure all day long, I was able to become comfortable. And so I wonder if I had been asked to lead a classroom for an entire day, if I could have gotten past that anxiety and that social pressure and realized that, oh, you know what? By the end of the day, I'm comfortable up here. So there's just things like that we didn't have the opportunity to do that I wish we did. And being asked to read things that I didn't want to read and that I genuinely wasn't interested in, and then being told that my opinions were wrong when I didn't think the same way as my teachers, I think that's just another part of the structure that caused me to dislike reading, when in fact, I probably could have ended up loving it if it was just restructured.
I feel like I can align with what you were just saying there about the classroom, because I still have this a little bit today, Nick, but certainly throughout my whole academic career or experience, like if I raised my hand and I got something wrong, or I was sort of pushed back, I got really embarrassed by that. That was not something that I wanted to have happen. And I'm quite sure that, like you, that led me to not put myself out there at a time when I wasn't sure. When, like you say, the times when you're not sure, or when you're wrong, or when you have a different opinion, are often the times when you break sort of new ground in yourself. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking to myself, there's a lot of times when I just did not want to insert myself because I wasn't sure that I was 100% right. And if I was wrong, that would make me look like I was dumb or something, right?
Yeah, same here. That's exactly how I felt.
I think people listening might be like, well, guy's the high school captain of the wrestling team. It's a football player. Where does the anxiety come from? Because you'd think, well, I can perform at a high level with people watching me. So it's not the crowd that's the issue necessarily, especially in wrestling when there's no team. I mean, there's a wrestling team, but when you're wrestling, it's you and your opponent, and that's it. So how do you reflect on that and think about that?
Yeah, I think it was the verbal fear of failure, being embarrassed around people who could be perceived as more intelligent because they did their homework and they knew how to answer questions and be a teacher's pet and things like that. But when it came to my athletic ability, I was confident because I did excel there, probably a lot more, and I learned in sports, like when you fail, you did something wrong and your coaches are there to help you. I think coaching was what I wanted, not negative feedback and being penalized. Like that's it. I mean, I'm kind of exploring this with you maybe for the first time, but when, let's say in wrestling, yes, it is a solo sport. You're performing in front of people, but when you fail, the coach says, hey, here's what to do next time. But when you fail in front of the class, they just go, wrong. Who else might know the answer?
Oh, yeah. Just on to the next person. Yeah.
On to the next person.
Yeah. Okay.
That's my guess.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes me think about sports, because I coached youth football for 6 years or so. And you see lots of different coaching styles. Not all coaches are like what you just said. There are some, and that same thing happens to the kid, right? If you tell the kid wrong, the kid's like, what? Instead of like, okay, here's how we can approach this next time. Here's what we'd like you to try this time. It's the same kind of thing. So it sounds like you had that environment with your coaches and maybe not with some of your teachers.
Right. I think so too. It actually brings up a memory one time playing football. I was a wide receiver and I lined up incorrectly. I was on the line when I should have been off, or I was off when I should have been on. And I had a coach explain to me, not just say, hey, get on the line or whatever, but like
Yeah.
sit down and explain to me the math and the rules. And I could understand it. I was capable of understanding it. And I never made that error again. So
Right.
yeah, I think I just had the right I had the right athletic coaches and not the right academic coaches, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, you got to cover the tight end or whatever. And you have to, yeah. Because actually that's a good point. And not that I'm getting in the weeds a little bit here, but it's kind of hard to tell like when you can be, especially with the formations that you see now. It's like who has to be on the line, who can be behind the line, and then you put motion into it and all this stuff. It can get confusing. So if you're just told that's wrong, you'd be like, okay, it's wrong. But if you're told this is why, this is how it works, like everything in life, this is how it works. Like, I got it. That's how it works.
Yeah.
So this event that you put on, this 8-hour event, tell me about that.
Well, over the last couple of years, as my marketing agency has grown, a number of our author clients have said to me, hey, you should host an event. They've said things like, we've met so many cool people in the comment section on your Instagram posts or the podcasters that you've introduced us to, but let's meet in person. You should host an event. And I had received that piece of feedback from a number of people. So I decided, let's host our first event. And it's something that I had always dreamt about a little bit. And whenever I would think a little bit too big, replicate something like a Grant Cardone or a Lewis Howes event, I would just be paralyzed and I wouldn't take any action. So what I decided to do was I called Lewis Howes and I said, Lewis, I'd like to host an event on the front side of your Summit of Greatness this year in Columbus. And I will bring an additional 50, 60 of my author clients to your event. So your target audience member, if we can work something out and kind of co-market and brand this together. And he said, sure, let's make it happen. So I hedged my risk a little bit by also including tickets to Lewis's event, which happened after mine. So there was a recency bias protection there in case my event didn't go well, but it went very well. So we had a bunch of our author clients in the room. We featured a number of them on stage. They gave presentations to my audience. We filmed it and chopped up some content for them. I had a bunch of my podcaster connections show up and attend, and we had a blast. So the first of many Bookthinkers events, I think, over the next couple of years. And I just enjoy that in-person networking opportunity, sit down and have a conversation with somebody over dinner or having a beer after the event and get to hang out in the same space for a couple of days.
And just for those people who don't know who Lewis Howes is, could you give a brief description of him?
Sure. Lewis hosts a very large podcast called The School of Greatness. And he's also written a number of personal development books. So he has millions of followers, and he was actually a former athlete too. He was a football player, played in I don't know if it was a Canadian Football League or some other outside NFL league for a little while. But yeah, podcaster, author, big personality. His event had 2,500 people at it, and just a really good person. I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time with him behind the scenes too. So if anybody is familiar with him, he's exactly who you would want him to be off camera. He just cares about men's mental health. He cares about healing trauma. That's kind of his world.
Okay. And I want to explore how you came to meet him and then establish enough of a rapport where you could make the kind of ask, which was very smart because it's a confidence building ask on your part, right? Plus it's confidence building for your first presentation, but it also makes you look like you're real. I mean, not that you're not real, but I mean, it brings validity.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. I've always, and we could talk about this in a minute, I've always built my credibility on the backs of other people in a good way with them in collaboration. I call it borrowing credibility. And we could talk, trust is transitive. We could talk about that in a minute. So Lewis, as my platform grew, specifically on Instagram, I would shout out a book, I would review a book, I would tag the authors. And as the audience started to grow, those authors would repost the content, maybe follow our account, and they became a little bit more accessible over time. So as I started my podcast, I reached out to Lewis a number of times. Again, he's just a big personality in the space. He draws a lot of attention. I wanted to borrow his credibility and get in front of his audience. And I knew the best way to do that would be through a podcast interview. But he told me no a number of times, but he did choose to follow the Bookthinkers account. So he was consuming our content over the last couple of years, which was great. And I'm very fortunate and lucky that that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But last year, for his Summit of Greatness in Columbus, it's an annual event, somebody on my team who lives in Lexington, Kentucky, said, "Hey, I'd like to attend this event. I'm a big fan of Lewis's. Like, would you want to go with me?" I said, "Yeah, of course." We also had another team member in Columbus at the time. And so we all went to Lewis's event last year, and I let him know that I was going because he was responsive. He would just say, "No, I don't want to be on your show right now. I don't have a book to promote." Okay, that's fine. So we go to the event, and I let him know that we'd be there and that I was bringing my team. I had a few other people from Bookthinkers come with us, and we posted about it a lot and showed him some love. And we were at one of the post-event sort of networking sessions, and Lewis popped in for a minute. And I walked over and he recognized me and he said, "Hey, Nick, what's going on, man? Like, thank you for posting all about the event and bringing your whole team." And he took some photos with us. And he had announced that he was releasing a book this year, 2023,
Okay.
in March. And so I said, "Hey, I'd love to help you promote the book, finally do that podcast interview that we're talking about," right? I gave him value for a while, promoting his content, promoting his books, attending his event, buying a number of tickets, showing him some love. And then finally, when it was my time to also serve him by hosting him on my podcast and talking about this upcoming book, which is a big lift, as we could talk about later too. When I made that ask, he said, "Yeah, I'd love to host you for a day in LA if you want to fly out, and we can record an episode for your podcast. And I can also just get to know you guys a little bit." So that's how it happened. I probably posted about him 10 or 15 times, showing love. I did ask for something in return, which was the podcast that didn't necessarily formulate or sort of formalize at first, but it did eventually. So then I flew out to LA and we spent 5 or 6 hours with him. We filmed the podcast interview, but then we also just hung out and he did a deep dive on my business and made some suggestions. And we did a little bit of networking together and built that relationship. So by the time I went for that ask, "Hey, I'd like to host an event on the front side of your event," sort of piggy front instead of piggy back, it was an easy yes, because again, I was also bringing 50 additional people to his event.
Right.
So by that time, he had said yes.
Okay. So I'm glad you went through that in the detail that you did, because you demonstrated a number of things. One, most importantly, is that if you're a one and done person, like I'll ask you once, and if you say no, I'm done, you're not going to get very far. Number two, when someone does say no to you, it doesn't mean no, it means not yet for most people. If you're not trying to, like, as long as you're not like on LinkedIn when you accept someone's connection and they immediately try to sell you something and then they keep sending you messages over and over. But you were like, okay, no, no's a not yet. That's how I'm interpreting your no's a not yet. But I still like Lewis. I still want to support what he's doing. I'm going to keep putting stuff out there that he can see that I'm not a one and done person. And then after you've made the personal connection, had him on the podcast, hung out with him a little while, yes, of course, things get much easier after that. And you have the, it's not crazy because you've already, like people say, given a lot of value before you ask him for something that you're not just asking him for, but it's mutually beneficial by bringing your people. That was really good. Really good.
Yeah. Thank you. And you're right. It is mutually beneficial. I'm always communicating the value for the potential guest on my show or, bringing people to Lewis's event. And yes, on the back end, I'm borrowing his credibility.
Mm-hmm.
That's enhancing my own brand, but that's not how I'm positioning it. Come on my show. I want to show everybody that we're hanging out. No, I'd like to introduce you to my audience. I find your work interesting. I want to do a deep dive and expose some people that probably don't know who you are to the world of Lewis Howes. And this is the best way that I can do that. So yeah, let's promote your book. And I know, having gone through this process now myself, that when an author is in book promo mode, they're willing to do more or willing to do things that they normally wouldn't be, because selling a book is tough and you kind of have to hit it from all angles. So
Yeah.
it's the
And
right time to approach.
yeah. And I want to I'm going to have you counsel me on my personal experience with my book a little bit later on that, just so, because it is hard. It's very, very difficult. You had mentioned when you said built my credibility on the backs of others, you said something about trust, and I didn't want to go on before I asked you about that.
Sure. So I believe that, especially on social media, trust is transitive. So if you remember the transitive property from high school math class, if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is also bigger than C, right? Here's how it kind of works with trust. Let's say that you trust Grant Cardone, and Grant Cardone is hanging out with me. We film a podcast together and he posts it. Well, you're more likely to trust me now as well, because I'm borrowing his credibility, and your trust of Grant trusts me, you'll trust me as well. So trust is sort of transitive in this world of social media. And that's why I think having a podcast has been so important for building my brand, because I'm able to provide value while borrowing credibility and gaining trust. So somebody like Lewis Howes or Grant Cardone, they've spent decades building their credibility. And a way that you can sort of accelerate that process for yourself is by being pictured with them, hanging out with them, podcasting with them. They've done all of the hard work. They have the big audience. So that's the best way to get in front of it. And their audience is also your target audience. So if you can post some content and they can repost it or share it with their audience, you're attracting the right type of person. So I think there's a lot of reasons to do it.
Okay, got it. Before I get into your business and what you're doing, you mentioned this getting exposed to podcasts initially when you were in college doing this internship. What were some of the early ones that you listened to that got you hooked?
I loved The Science of Success with Matthew Bodner. That wasn't an interview style show. At least it wasn't when it first started, but it did reference a lot of books. And then for interview style shows, I loved the Tim Ferriss Show, and I still do. That's one of my favorite podcasts of all time, and a whole host of other shows like that.
I also made the change from radio to podcasts about 6 years ago and had never listened to a podcast before. And actually, I met a guy this morning who has not yet listened to a podcast. And I thought to myself, wow, there are still there's still a lot of room to go. In other words, before podcasts really get into everyone's ears or eyes. But I did the same thing. I changed from radio to podcast, and I have never gone back. I just spend every minute that I can listening to something that either entertains me or makes me smarter, or gives me an idea. Why not? Right. Yeah. And how did Bookthinkers come to be?
When I was in college, I ran my own house painting business for 2 years. It was part of a school program, sort of. So there was some infrastructure in place, and then they would teach you how to hire your friends and sell jobs and go around and paint houses.
Like College Pro, but an independent. It's something that was just at your school.
It was like College Pro. It wasn't independent just at my school, but it was a smaller version of College Pro that was more focused on operations and less just on selling. But yeah, it's kind of like College Pro.
Okay.
And so I ran my own house painting business for 2 summers. And although I was one of the lower performers in the group of students at UNH, I did become best friends with a lot of these other entrepreneurial minded people. One of them was Alec Clement, and Alec is still a great friend of mine today. So once we had both put our paintbrushes away, I think forever, we would still meet on a weekly basis and just talk about entrepreneurship. So now I'm a senior at UNH. We're meeting on a weekly basis, talking about starting another business. And we're whiteboarding on weekends, exploring the same books. Right now I'm reading books, and so is he. And one day I walked in and I said, hey, everybody's asking me the same questions about the books that I'm reading, because now I'm a reader. Like, that's a big part of my identity, a total 180. And I said, everybody's asking me the same questions. What was your favorite takeaway from Rich Dad, Poor Dad? Or, what's the best book on habits? And I said, we should find a place to just document all of our favorite takeaways from the books we're reading. So version number 1 of Bookthinkers was just a website where I put all of my favorite takeaways from the books I was reading. I sort of ranked them by genre, and he did the same. And then another one of my friends, Derek, quickly got involved, a high school friend from home, who was always entrepreneurial, but like we didn't fit together back in the day, as far as business was concerned, but now maybe we did. So he invited me to coffee and he said, hey, I think we could build a website or a mobile application where everybody could categorize their favorite takeaways from the books they're reading. That would be pretty cool. So Derek joined the team, and it was kind of the three amigos at the beginning. Long story short, that mobile app website build eventually fell apart. So we spent tens of thousands of dollars as recent college graduates, hundreds of hours of our time trying to build this platform that didn't really work.
Was it the platform or the partnership that didn't work?
Both.
Okay.
Both. So we outsourced the build to a company in Argentina that went out of business. None of us were tech guys, so we were outsourcing everything. And as young, hot-headed, entrepreneurial-minded people, we didn't see eye to eye on anything. Derek had a company that he had started before Bookthinkers called Label Radar that was starting to get some traction. So when the mobile app company fell apart and the build fell apart, Derek said, hey, I want to go pursue my thing that's really starting to gain some traction full time, which he did and ended up selling it for 7 figures. And like it really took off.
Okay.
So Alec and I were kind of left together, and I had this full-time software sales job. So I went full-time with the company that I interned at. Alec was still kind of figuring things out. So he couldn't continue to put money into the business. So I said, hey, let me buy you out and figure this out another time, because I was making some money. And in anticipation of building this app, we wanted to build an audience so that we could sell the app into the audience. So I was posting book reviews. I was kind of the face of the social media. And so when everything fell apart, that was right around the same time that authors started to reach out and say, hey, Nick, I love your book reviews. Can I pay you to review my book? So it was a different form of monetization that was coming really just directed at me, which gave me the opportunity to ask Alec, hey, can you leave the business essentially? And can I kind of take over from here while you figure things out? And so, that's a very short version of what happened, but that's sort of the origin story.
And from there, how did you see the path, or how did the path become evident for you to really start helping authors promote the books? Because you're not a publisher. I don't think you're a publisher. You're not a publisher. But you basically are coming on the backside of the publisher's work with the author to elevate the awareness and I guess sales and branding of the book. I'm sure you can explain it better, but how did that develop? Because you had a cool idea. People's like, hey, I like your reviews. Will you review my book? I'll pay you something to write me a review. And now you're reaching 1 million people a month, I think is what it said in the bio. Take us on that journey.
Yeah, I was reading a lot of business books on freelancing, books on book marketing. And so as people continued to reach out and say, hey, I'd like to pay you to review my book, and I would $50 here, $100 here. I knew I was onto something, right? Dollars were transferring from somebody else's bank account into mine. And as the audience continued to grow, those dollar values went up. Now we charge thousands of dollars for book reviews. But I would always follow up with the author client, because again, I was taught to do this in business books. I would follow up and I'd say, hey, can we jump on a call? I'd like to learn a little bit more about why you wrote the book. Is the book a lead mechanism for anything else? Coaching, consulting, speaking, some other type of business?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it so difficult to sell books? What's the pain feel like? Why is it painful? And then I come to find out that most of my clients that were coming to me, they spent decades learning something, years writing about it. They think it's special. They've been very successful with it. And then nobody buys their book. So they come to me because they're on Instagram and they say, you can reach people. I'll pay you to put my book out there, right? So I try to get earlier in that process. Most people aren't spending 6 months in anticipation of a launch, building a launch strategy and selling and marketing their book. So I would try out all sorts of things, most of which didn't work as I'm working with these authors behind the scenes. And I probably said things like, hey, I'd love to work full-time in this space someday. I have a degree in marketing. I understand small business. Let me work with you, sort of as an intern to all of these authors, just understanding how it worked. And so, like I said, we'd try all sorts of things. Most of them didn't work. Some of them did. So just to give kind of an update, today I have 10 people on my team. We support hundreds of authors a year in some type of paid engagement. We have sort of 5 core services. I'll just mention the ones that you did on the intro. We do short form video content where we help an author turn a physical book into 50 to 100 pieces of video for social media. That's good for Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, everything. We do podcast booking, so we can place an author on up to 100 shows to talk about their book. And then we do book reviews still today. So we can post about a book and it can reach 50,000 people and they can sell 500 books just with a single Instagram post. And so that's the magic of social media. And that's kind of where we fit into this puzzle. We also do social media management, some author ecosystem strategy and stuff like that. And all of that happened through failure in iteration and just trying new things out, right? It was a short period of time, but it felt like a long period of time to me.
And yeah, well, it always feels a long time to the entrepreneur, right? Because you're like, this should be faster. We should be, at least that's how I always feel. So let's look at the process here a little bit, if you don't mind. So I write a book. Well, I'll preface this by saying, so here's the easiest way to write. This is me talking, not you. You tell me if you agree. The easiest way for you to have a best-selling book is to be famous or very well known. The easiest way for you to have a top-ranked podcast is for you to be famous already. So people who have large audiences tend to have an easier time breaking in at a very high level to something. I guess that makes sense. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the book's good or better than some other writer could do, or that the podcast is. They probably are, but it's, that's the easiest way. The majority of people who write books aren't famous. They might be famous in a small circle of people and they could be very famous in that small circle, and outside of that circle, no one's ever heard of them. So the profile of the majority of the people that you end up working with, Nick, looks like what? I just want to make sure that people aren't scared away here. Like, you have to be, I guess I want them to know, what do you actually have to be for you to be successful working with them?
We work with people on both ends of the spectrum, and most of them are somewhere in between, given the spectrum that you just kind of described. So as my business continues to grow, we're in an interesting place right now because I actually get more fulfillment doing the platform building, not serving somebody that already has millions of followers, but somebody who has been very successful offline, doesn't have an audience, but they're transitioning to a point in their life where they'd like to write, speak, coach, consult, maybe make courses, and they don't know what any of that infrastructure looks like. And I can step in and say, you do have something unique to say. Now you just need a partner, a team to support you building that audience. Because I do think a lot of the people that are famous, they have some great things to say. They have great people around them. But a lot of them get famous when they're pretty young in this world of entrepreneurship. And then they just kind of ride that momentum instead of skill building. So I like to serve people that are a little bit older with a smaller audience that do have something unique and a great track record to highlight. And then we can get in there and film video content and distribute it for them. We can place them on podcasts and get those podcasters to be their biggest fan. We can put them in front of our audience and get them more followers. And so again, those are some of the core things that we do. And I love to serve people like that.
When somebody comes to you, what's the ideal? If there is an ideal person, what does that ideal person look like when they first reach out to you? And then what do they look like when you're done with them?
Yeah, we're never done with them.
I was hoping you might say that,
Yeah. So when somebody comes to us, they are in the second half of their career. They're a little bit older. They have a strong track record of some success, probably in the world of business, managing a big company. Maybe they've just sold a big company, and now they'd like to focus on impact as maybe a second career. So they're probably sitting at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're not focused on food, water, shelter. They're not focused on ego or anything. They're focused on impact, self-actualization. They want to share what they've done to become so financially successful, so healthy, so happy. And so they're not really concerned about money. They're kind of in a different stage of life. This person has the desire to speak, to coach, to consult. They don't really have those things figured out yet, but they've written the book, and that's kind of step number one. So they have that $20 low ticket item that they can get out there, and we can use that book to get them on podcasts. We can use that book to put them in front of our audience. We can use that book to sort of, what we do when we film content with people is we go through their book and we look for every standalone piece of unique value that we can find, and we build a video. We like turn the powerful opinion piece up, and we go out there and create that content for them. So, and then as we build that audience, they're having viral moments. They're starting to build out this ecosystem. They're getting paid to speak. They're getting paid to coach and consult. So you mentioned something about the books before, which I think is a funny way to put it. It's not the best written books, it's the best selling books. So you need to sell. You need to get exposure. You need to market and brand and position. And that's what my business can help people do. So it turns into this symbiotics kind of like ecosystem where somebody comes into your world on social media, they buy your book, they want to learn more, and then we kind of have those opportunities available to them. Okay. Coaching, speaking, things like that.
Got it. All right. Thank you for doing that. That makes sense. So let's shift to learning more about your podcast and your book. Your podcast, as I mentioned, is called Bookthinkers, Life-Changing Books. And you've got 150 episodes or something. And so congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you.
And I mentioned some of the people that you've had on at the beginning, but is everyone that comes on your podcast an author that is promoting a book, or why should someone subscribe, follow the podcast?
I started the podcast because I noticed that as my account was growing, a lot of my favorite authors were reposting content, commenting, following us. And so they became accessible. And as I started to read about borrowing credibility and how trust is transitive, I thought I'd like to position myself with these people. So how can I do that? By also providing value to my audience, but also to the author. And this idea of podcasting came up originally when I was having a conversation with a mentor of mine on an Instagram Live, Evan Carmichael. So Evan was looking, he was kind of pushing me to do something that made me uncomfortable. And he just asked, hey, Nick, if you would interview some of your favorite authors on camera and then post that content for everybody, would that get you uncomfortable? And I thought about, yes, I think it would. And he said, well, start a podcast. So that's what I did. Evan was podcast guest number 1. And very quickly, we had some of my favorite authors, Russell Brunson, Grant Cardone, Jim Quick, Bob Berg. And so we were off and running, and my audience loved it. And so did the guests. And I had access to people that would normally charge $50,000, $100,000 for a consultation, but just because I have a podcast, they're willing to give me their time for free.
Right.
And so what I started to do was a follow-up on the book. I read the book. I had additional questions, things that might have been missing, things that I was interested in learning more about. And I would host that conversation, and then I would share it with everybody. And the podcast has changed a little bit over time, but in the beginning, I would involve my audience and I would say, hey, you guys read the 48 Laws of Power. What questions do you have for Robert Greene? And we would sort of crowdsource questions, and people felt like they were involved. So it was a solo podcast at first, then a community podcast. Now I have a co-host who's on my team. And now a lot of the authors that we interview are part of our paid network. So they're people that we're building with, and they're kind of paying to come on the show. But that's the podcast. why should people listen? If you want a deep dive on a book to understand whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you in advance of purchasing it, you can kind of get that 30 to 45 minute look at the book before committing to 6 or 8 hours of reading. So that's sort of the reason to jump on. And we have a lot of cool conversations that are very different. Somebody like Alex Hormozy is very popular right now. He's been on 1,000 podcasts. And the number one comment on our show on YouTube is like, thank you for not having the cut and paste conversation. Thank you for talking about things that are a little bit different, just like you've done today, Mike. Like, I haven't covered a lot of this on any other shows, which is great.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah. And so that's the podcast.
Yeah. I want to ask you about podcast booking as part of your service, and podcasts are a very important marketing component for any author, right? You got to get on podcasts. I went on probably 50 when I did my book. I'm not sure that any of them moved the needle for me at all, Nick. Or the book just sucked. I mean, one or the other. So how do you think about that, and how do you cultivate the right podcast for people, especially authors who are not super well known outside of certain circles?
So my agency focuses on fit. So making sure that the audience is a great fit for the subject of the book over everything else. Then we optimize for the podcast relationship. Now, things were a little bit different with my book coming out. I wanted to go for fit, but also volume. I wanted to get to know a lot of podcasters. I wanted to have conversations with them offline after the show, which we'll probably do, and talk a little bit about the book and ways that we can kind of co-promote it if you find this conversation valuable, things like that. So I think fit is very important. I think repurposing content on social media is really important. Sometimes I'll host an interview with a world famous author and it will only get hundreds or maybe 1,000, 2,000 traditional downloads, but we'll repurpose that content on social media and it will get 50,000 impressions. And so we kind of optimize for that as well. We make sure there's a social media presence for our clients. We didn't do everything for my book launch. It's, what is it, like the shoemaker's son has no shoes type of thing.
Yeah, sure.
And that's what's been really important. There's also some follow-up, like you'll get an email after we're done that asks you to please include some certain links in your podcast description. And we also, I'll just kind of share the number with you because it's interesting. I have around 150 podcast interviews going live through the month of November. So I've already recorded about 100 and they're all coming out within a condensed period of time, most in the first and second week of November, all being distributed on 5-6 different platforms with very specific links in the description. And so it's kind of an SEO play. It's a podcaster relationship play. It's a lot of shows in a very condensed period of time going live. So that will lead to sporadic purchasing of the book, Rise of the Reader. I'm taking a different angle talking about this at a macro level rather than inserting the book every 15 minutes like I do on some other shows.
Okay.
Just because I find your questions very interesting and maybe your audience is going to find this kind of macro discussion interesting rather than me just shoving the book down everyone's throats. And I'll give you an example of something that we teach some of our clients. So let's say that the goal is not to sell books, but it's to create coaching clients. When somebody asks a question, like when Mike, you ask a question, I would answer through the lens of, hey, that's a great question. Typically when I'm coaching one-on-one, here's how I would answer it. Or typically when I'm speaking on stage, here's how I would answer it. Or when you asked me about how did it happen, I could have said, in the first book I read was Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but I wish it was Rise of the Reader, my first book, because there's so many things that I didn't know back then that I know now. And I just wish that I had access to this book, right? So we teach people to kind of do those things. This conversation's taken a different turn, but I think there's kind of an art of selling the book, an art of selling the complementary products and services when the target user for those is in the audience. And then there's a condensed kind of release with certain backlinks. So it's an SEO play, sporadic purchasing. There's kind of a few different things that I'm thinking about.
Okay. So the takeaway there for me is there's a lot more, writing a book is just step one. If I listen to Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's doing a lot of podcasts now because he has a book. And the one thing I took away from it, and this was on Tim Ferriss too, is like, he said, all these people think they can create something and it's someone else's job to sell it. And he's like, I don't believe that at all. He's like, it's my job to sell it, whether it's a book, my movie, my voting for me, whatever. I have to sell that. And I thought that was very refreshing and eye-opening, because you think a guy in his, stage would be like, it sells itself because it has my name on it. But he's like, no.
Yeah, you got to get out there and sell. I remember from his first book, Total Recall, he talked about being one of the only actors that was willing to travel internationally to promote a movie. Most would travel a little bit domestically, but he said, hey, there's, the United States population represents a very small percentage of this planet. Let me go out there and be the only actor willing to travel to whatever, Seoul, South Korea, or something like that. And promote the heck out of this movie. And that's why, and then he'd get a stake in the back end, like toy sales or whatever. And that's how he made so much money. It's so cool. I agree. You've got to get out there and promote.
Yeah. I think he was talking about Twins with him and Danny DeVito, where he did that. And I think it grossed as much internationally as it did domestically. So he's like, and we were getting 37%. So it would be silly of me not to sell this thing. It was really good perspective from someone who's super successful, but still understands that you have to sell. So your book, Rise of the Reader, November 1st, it comes out. I love that you've read over 400 books. I'm in the upstairs of my office. Downstairs is my library, and I kind of wish I was showing it because it's like similar to yours. And coming out of college, I was actually an English major, so I was reading, but I was reading the books that you had to read to get through. I wasn't reading anything about business or leadership or self-development. And now I've read lots and lots of those things, and I'm really into biographies now too. By the way, have you ever heard of Founders Podcast with David Senra?
I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up.
You have got to become aware of this guy, and you have got to get him on your show. We'll talk more offline about it, but he's one of my favorites.
Okay.
He reads a biography a week. It's a solo podcast, and then he just gives you basically all of his notes on it. And he is so committed, It's just fun to be a listener because you could just get all of his excitement. Anyway, Founders Podcast. But your book, you've got I could only read the things that were available, but one of the things that I wrote down, and I'd like you to talk to me about, is you say something like swap 15 minutes of social media scrolling, and we've been talking about social media a lot, for 15 minutes of reading, and that can dramatically impact 20 different areas of your life. That's a good teaser. Can you explore that a little bit for me and us?
Sure. Yeah. So 15 minutes of reading for somebody who's just starting out is probably about 10 pages. And if you can do that twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, by replacing something like social media scrolling in the morning and maybe just the first 15 minutes of your Netflix in the evening, you can read 20 pages a day.
Yeah.
20 pages over, let's say, the 5 weekdays, that's 100 pages a week. And most of these books are 200 to 250 pages these days. And so by reading 100 pages a week, you can read a book every 2 weeks, every 2.5 weeks. And so that's how we get to that number 20. And
okay.
That's how fast we can get these books done over the course of a year. If you read a book every 2 weeks, that's 26 books. If you read a book every 2.5, 2.25 weeks, or whatever the math is, then you can get to 20 books. That's 20 different areas of your life that you can improve, 20 different skills that you can develop, 20 different people that you can learn about, 20 different problems that you can solve, because that's exactly what these personal development style books can do for you. And again, it can happen in as little as 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening. And so when I think about my favorite Netflix shows of all time, I mean, I can't even remember some of the main characters 6 months later. But these books, they serve us for the rest of our lives if we implement them and make changes. And so I'm not a robot. I still watch TV and stuff like that. I still watch a lot of sports, but I do focus on serving my future self at least a little bit every single day.
Yeah, very well. Listening to podcasts instead of listening to the radio and reading 20 pages a day, if that's like having your own custom designed school.
Yes.
Like we talked about school at the beginning, right? Like that's a way to have your own custom designed school, expand your thinking, get creative with your ideas, give yourself the belief, because belief comes before confidence, but give yourself the belief that you can do something you didn't think you could do, and enough belief that you can commit to taking at least the first step. And man, what a difference that can make in your life.
Yes. I mean, here I am. I've only been reading for about 10 years and I'm in a wildly different place. So that's how fast it can happen. I mean, these books literally condense, especially biographies, which you just mentioned, they literally condense decades of somebody else's lived experience into days of consumption. You can't beat that. I mean, I kind of joke around recently, like I'm 29 years young, but if you include the books behind me, I'm thousands of years old.
Right.
And I've aged thousands of years in the last 10 years.
That's beautiful, the way you just put that. That's great. Well, look, everybody, get the book, Rise of the Reader. I will definitely be getting this book and reading it. Check out Nick's podcast, Bookthinkers, life-changing books. Just amazing people on there, as I said at the very beginning. I have not been on the show yet, but there are other amazing people on there that you should definitely check out. And Bookthinkers is the name of Nick's company. Nick Hutchison, you should check out. And Nick, before we leave, is there anything that you'd like to share that I just blew or didn't ask you about or skipped over or whatever?
I'll just throw one thing out there for everybody. If you're new to the space and I've convinced you that reading is worth doing, but you're not really sure where to start, go to Instagram at Bookthinkers and DM me. Tell me about a problem that you currently have. Tell me about a skill that you'd like to develop or something in between. I'll probably ask a few follow-up questions, but I will provide a book recommendation. And I will act as an accountability partner, put a note in my system and reach back out to you in 3 months to see if you've read the book and what you thought of it. So that's open to anybody that wants to reach out and become part of our community. There's no judgment. It's a safe space. I think if you choose not to read these books, you're choosing to live under your potential. So hopefully after today's conversation, you've heard about some of this value and you're interested in getting involved. And even if you've been in the space for a long time, but you're like, man, I've read every sales book, but I just can't get to the next level. What recommendations do you have? I can still provide value.
Nice. Oh, that's a great offer. Thank you for making that.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So Instagram at Bookthinkers. Nick, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's just been great to get to know you, and I'm super impressed by what you're doing as well. And thank you for sharing so much. And listen, everybody that's listening, please maximize the greatness that's inside of you. Nick's been talking about maximizing greatness in all the authors that he works with and the people he has on his podcast. And you have greatness inside of you that I can guarantee you are not maximizing. So why don't you think about that and pull something out and take that first step towards maximizing more of the greatness that's inside of you. And we'll see each other next time. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. And before you go, I just have 3 requests for you. 1, if you like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing or following the podcast on whatever podcast platform you prefer. If you're really into it, leave me a review, write something nice about me, give me 5 stars or whatever you feel is most appropriate. Number 2, I've got a book. It's called Owner Shift: How Getting Selfish Got Me Unstuck. It's an Amazon bestseller. And I'd love for you to read it or listen to it on Audible or wherever else, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can get it everywhere. If you're looking for inspiration that will help you unlock your greatness and potential, order or download it today so that you can have your very own copy. And if you get it, please let me know what you think. Number 3, my newsletter. I do a newsletter every Thursday, and I talk about things that are interesting to me or I give more information about the podcast and the podcast guests that I've had and the experiences that I've had with them. You can sign up for the podcast today at my website, which is my name, MikeMalatesta.com. You do that right now, put in your email address, and you'll get the very next issue. The newsletter is short, thoughtful, and designed to inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you.